Shall we start now, ma'am?
Yes, sure.
Hello, everyone. Present here virtually. I am Pallavi here, and I welcome you all for today's session, which is titled as Shakespeare Film Adaptation, the Indian Spectacle. And presenting this session, we have with us our today's expert, Dr. Injala Zaini, ma'am. Dr. Injala Zaini, Research Fellow at the Folger Shakespeare Library, USA. She has been working in the field of madness in literature for the past 4 years. She has edited several anthologies related to madness and cinema, and her research papers have been published in numerous journals of international repute. Her ongoing project is based on the screen adaptation of Shakespeare's most popular dramas. She has a university teaching experience of 3 years and now spends time for fostering quality research in her field. Without wasting much time, I am welcome to Dr. Injala Zaini, ma'am. You may start now, ma'am.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And so here we are to discuss Shakespeare again. The question is, why are we still talking about Shakespeare after so many centuries? And we really need to find it out, especially in the Indian context. So the title for today's session is Shakespeare Film Adaptations, the Indian Spectacle. Today we're going to talk about only the Indian film adaptations of Shakespeare. And when I say Indian, of course, we are quite diverse, both in our culture and also in our movies. But today I decided to talk majorly about Bollywood only because of its wider audience. But definitely we have Shakespeare adaptations in other cinemas too, like Bhojpuri, Malayali, and Tamil. We cannot totally rule them out because they stand quite significant. Bengali cinema, Malayali cinema, Tamil cinema. Why is Shakespeare being adapted by far? And when I talk about the Indian spectacle, it only means how Indians look at Shakespeare. So let's first of all begin with the history. How did Shakespeare come about us? What is that interlink between literature and cinema? How did Shakespeare pave his way into the Indian subcontinent, the culture? First, he has to become a part of our popular culture. Then only he would become a part of cinema. There has to be a time when he came in. Most of the authors and critics position Shakespeare in colonization, in the concept of colonization. Vishwanathan studied it in detail and wrote a lot of literature telling how Shakespeare in India was a product of colonization. First, he had to come into theater, then he would come into cinema. So very initially, how it started. Shakespeare's plays were used to entertain Britishers in India. Theater was the primary source of entertainment for everyone. We did not have cinema, but we had theater. And of course, we had Shakespeare, and any theater was incomplete without Shakespeare. We brought Shakespeare first into local plays. When I say local plays, that technically means theaters where Indians were also going to entertain themselves. It started off with Britishers. It went along the Indian mob. First, Britishers used these dramas to entertain themselves. Later, all sorts of dramas were used to civilize native Indians. And see how today it has become a part of Indian education system. It has become a part of our collective subconscious. We cannot take Shakespeare out of our minds. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the Indianization of Shakespeare started to commence. And who did that? Parsi theater. Parsi theater brought that desi masala content on the stage into Shakespeare. You can call those plays melodramatic versions. When I say melodramatic versions, it technically means bombardment of dialogues, costume, and language. So that synthesis of Western and Eastern culture could be seen in these Parsi dramas. They took Shakespeare, they put over him the veil of Indian culture, and they presented it to the Indian audience. And we see this trend is still following up. Now I'd like to talk about the very, very initial phase of Shakespeare in cinema. How did Shakespeare and when did Shakespeare come into cinema? The very initial adaptations. So we have three phases. One, very true and honest adaptation. Second phase, adaptation, but the Indian background was given to the adaptation. The storyline was not changed, but Indianization was done in terms of setting, names, dialogues, and of course, music. 3, we now have movies like Haider. We now have movies like Omkara, and these adaptations are Indianized, but they also change the storyline a bit. The Indianization is done, the transformation is done in the storyline as well. So we have these three phases in Indian cinema. Sohrab Modi, who was also a theater artist, who was also an actor, brought Shakespeare initially into the Indian cinema. The first film adaptation was as early as 1932. And with movies like Saidi Hawas, movies like Hatili Dulhan, now they are so old that we would not even find posters or flyers for these movies. So today we talk only about Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth. But during those times, people were actually talking about the less popular dramas as well. Richard III, Comedy of Errors, Taming of the Shrew. And we find these kind of stories being popular in the Indian cinema. One, there were not too many movies. Two, the directors were conscious of the fact that they were adapting from Shakespeare. They did not change the storyline too much. They kept it intact, but they Indianized it They gave Indian names, costumes, setting, and they knew it's gonna work. They knew the psychology of the potential audience, target audience. And even in those times, it was 1932, it was 1948, they knew the people who would be coming to watch the movies would be the elite, would be those who knew Shakespeare, would be those who knew English. Either they'd be Britishers or they'd be very rich Indians. And there was no much difference between the two in their academic level and understanding level. I'd like to start talking about major adaptations of popular plays, how they came about, what changed, what did not change, what can change. We all are aware of one name, that's Vishal Bharadwaj, and we should, because we owe a large part of respect to him. He has made Shakespeare common for Indian audience to watch. He has brought comfort of Indian audience with Shakespeare. And he belongs to the third phase that I was talking about. He is not only Indianizing the setting, he is also Indianizing the theme. He is Indianizing the endings. He knows what would work. He knows that he needs to show what the audience wants to say. We largely have two major adaptations in Indian cinema. And when I talk about Macbeth, I also talk about Viram, even though it's not a Bollywood movie, but it became quite popular because Kunal Kapoor starred. And when you talk about Macbeth, you have different kind of images in your head. The witches, the ghost, Lady Macbeth, and her madness. We find two kinds of settings, these two kinds of movies. We see people speaking beautiful Urdu in Maqbool. We find classic characters. We find actors who are themselves on screen all the time, like Irfan. The Maqbool was a difficult movie to produce, to direct. Maqbool's script was difficult to write. Vishal Bharadwaj had Macbeth in mind, and then he had the Indianness in mind. There were Urdu songs, there were Urdu dialogues. He knew the dialogues had to be powerful. Now, Macbeth's dialogues were powerful. How to make similarly powerful dialogues for Indian cinema? Now, Shakespeare resides in every language. When we have Shakespeare in mind, no matter what language we have, we end up creating powerful dialogues. So what we see is Indianization is being done, the setting is changed, the characters are behaving differently, but Shakespeare is not dead. We still find Shakespeare lingering everywhere. When we watch Maqbool, in every scene that follows, for the people who have already read Macbeth, they will know what's going to happen next. It's going to come. They're able to predict, but they also find certain elements that they were not expecting. They find surprises. Their reactions are mixed. Even though the character of Taboo is not somebody to sympathize with, we might not sympathize with Lady Macbeth, but we might end up sympathizing with Taboo. Macbeth originally Macbeth does not seem as innocent as Irfan in Makbul. So that is exactly the difference. That's exactly how we have pictured these characters. Now in Viram, we have a different kind of image. Now Viram is more about chivalry. Viram is a hero. We see people following him. We see people getting influenced by his personality, by the way he walks, the way he talks. And we find now Macbeth becoming a wonderful hero in front of us. It's the line between good and bad, where evil is thinning for us. When we talk about Shakespeare, we need to talk about Haider. Majority of Indian audience not aware of Haider being an adaptation of Hamlet. Now Haider is very different as compared to Hamlet. Vishal changed things a lot for us. Now the initial adaptation of Hamlet was Khun Ka Khun back in early 90s. This was a literal adaptation. Things were not changed as much. The storyline did not change. All the part about revenge wasn't changed. We had Hamlet as Hamlet in Khun Ka Khun. But in Haider, we do not have Haider as typically Hamlet. In fact, Hamlet is a confused being. His psyche is not as clear as Haider's. We know what Haider wants, but we do not know what Hamlet wants. To be or not to be is not even a question for Haider. He knows he wants revenge. And now the setting has not only been changed, but completely transformed. When we put Hamlet in the worst part of Kashmir insurgency, we make Haider a militant. Now, Haider does not only have the responsibility of taking the personal revenge, the family revenge, but he also has the responsibility as a Kashmiri to fight with other things happening. The political scenario becomes important for him. Does not want to become the king, but definitely wants to do something for his people. We find Haider as an educated person coming back from Aligarh University. So he has finished a part of education. He knows what's happening around him. He's an aware human being. How he drifts into madness. Now we see find madness in Hamlet. We know Hamlet is not really mad. He's only pretending to be mad. But Haider seems quite sure of things to do. Even though we see madness, but that madness is more of a fury. It's more of anger towards everything happening in his own life and around him. We see double stress, personal stress and socio-political stress. We again find people speaking beautiful Urdu in Haider. In Khun Ka Khun, we find more typical Hindi dialogues. So when we talk about Othello, I find only one significant movie that does justice to Othello, and that's of course Omkara. Now we shall change the backdrop completely. Now we are in UP, we are in Meerut. Our language changes, our mannerisms change. We accept Othello as Omkara. We are able to relate to the character. Now we shall take a white Desdemona. Kareena Kapoor looks a lot like Desdemona. We have Iago. We have other characters which largely look like the characters we have read so far. But we have cheesy item numbers. We have dialogues full of slangs. We have a lot of abusive language running around. Vishal Bharadwaj makes it normal for us. He normalizes it. We accept it almost naturally. We do not question it because we are able to find Shakespeare in this. We are able to find Omkara. We find in Omkara the character of Othello living. We find those emotions intact. We find the emotions of jealousy, stupidity, spontaneity, impulsive actions living on the screen. We find good friendship in the character of Vivek Oberoi. We find pure love in the character of Kareena. We have an entertainment Bipasha. We sympathize with her, we relate to her. The emotional aspect touched us in all of the Vishal Bharadwaj movies. Apart from Vishal Bharadwaj, we have a wonderful, significant adaptation that is Tanama Love, an adaptation of Shakespeare's drama, A Midsummer Night's Dream. We find a romantic comedy, we find people falling in love, we find a lot of love connections. Who falls in love with who? We have complete entertainment for all these 2-3 hours. We do not lose the touch of Shakespeare in this movie. And that's exactly what's happening in the modern movies. We still remember Shakespeare while watching these. We know what's going to happen. We can predict, but we also have surprises. We relate to them at 2 levels. Those people who have read Shakespeare relate with these movies, modern adaptations, at 2 levels. 1, they remember what they read. 2, they want it to be relevant to them. Shakespeare will never die out. Shakespeare shall always remain relevant to our time. He is an immortal figure, and he has been living in the respective time and place, different cultures, different traditions, different languages, and it doesn't really bother Shakespeare. And for us, if we see people dressing up like us in the movies, we see people talking like us, we see people talking naturally. Animal Love was a success in that case because we in our normal lives would not be talking like people of Makbul. We would not be speaking those dialogues, but we do speak what people in Animal Love speak. This is the colloquial language. This was our language, and we totally related to this. This is how we dress up in our lives. So Animal Love as a love story, as a comedy, was totally a grand success. Might not have done great in the box office, but has done great as an adaptation of Shakespeare. Comedy of Errors. I did not find any significant modern adaptation, but I did find initial adaptations and very beautiful ones. When Gulzar was writing Angur, he definitely had the entire script of Comedy of Errors in front of him. And he wrote transliterating the dialogues, and he wrote bringing Indian elements, but he kept the script intact. He knew what would make the Indian audience laugh, and in Angur we have a brand of humor. We can still laugh on those witty jokes that Gulzar wrote, and we would find when we read the drama Comedy of Errors, we find very similar jokes. And when jokes are translated into another language, the fun, the humor remains intact, but we change the cultural backdrop only. Similarly, Dudhani Char was a beautiful movie, again an adaptation of comedy. We find people dressing up much like the people dressed up during those times. It was a very relatable movie. They talked very casually, and it made it beautiful on the screen. When I present these 5 pictures, it says a lot about the history of Shakespeare. Most of the times, most frequent adaptation is of Romeo and Juliet. For obvious reasons, the Indian audience loves to watch love stories, and especially the steamy ones. It started off with movies like Ek Duje Ke Liye. We have some difference. We have the difference of theme in this movie, even though it's about families not accepting the partners. But we also have something very different. The music is totally top in the charts. They have difference in languages. These two people are not only having conflicts of families, but also having conflicts with each other. They have difficulty connecting with each other as well. The director presents them as very, very different individuals. Now, originally in Romeo and Juliet, as Shakespeare wrote, they were very different individuals too, but they connected almost naturally. The love clicked in the very initial phase. The Juliet was not thinking, what am I doing in my life? Not even once. Juliet was sure that she loves Romeo. We then have Kayamat se Kayamat tak, which stands as a midline between Ek Duje Ke Liye and very modern ones like Ishq Zade. And we find Kayamat se Kayamat tak a very sensational movie. We have a very, very famous kiss scene. The director put it, he knew he had to bring this spark into the love story, into the regular love story where people are just killing each other, the cases of honor killing. Honor killing had become quite a common theme by then with movies like Sanam Bewafa. But when he was presenting Romeo and Juliet on the screen, the director knew he had to bring something amazing. So we have a question, do you think Romeo and Juliet is still relevant today? Well, most definitely it is. And how? Of course, I'm going to talk about it just now. So when Kayamat se Kayamat tak was being watched, perhaps by our parents, perhaps when we were quite young, we watched this movie. Having a long kiss scene, physical intimacy on screen, watching it during those times, quite sensational, quite theatrical, audience hailing and cheering in cinema theaters, made Romeo and Juliet successful. Something extra was required, an X factor into the regular script of Romeo and Juliet. Action was more intense, fighting, running in the forest, packing bags with a small backpack as we see on Amir Khan's shoulders. Of course, it's not enough, but we find such kind of images. We find Juhi running hands in hands with Amir. We find now, okay, we have a question. Good evening, ma'am, I'm from Philippines. How about Aladdin? Good evening, Judy. Aladdin, wow, what a beautiful comparison we have here. Yes, in Aladdin, we see a very subtle romantic love story. We find two people in love. We find less of sensationalism. We find people running after them too. We find, and we also have a very modern adaptation of Aladdin, which looks something like Aladdin. There was a series, Hatim, and in that too, we find people running like this. And in Aladdin, we would find the Middle Eastern touch. We find in the costumes that dreamy element. We find it in the dialogues too, and how Aladdin has been adapted so many times. It has more adaptation. It has adaptations for children. It again has adaptations for adults who like to watch more of romance. We see half-naked heroines. We do not find people completely dressed up. We wanted to watch that. So the actress is wearing the costume of more like a belly dancer, required or not required, but those kind of sensationalisms were being put in there. So I continue with the adaptations of Romeo and Juliet here. In the most recent ones, Ram Leela, Shahzade, Isak, we find a common theme running. We find something common in all of these. We find characters not subtle. We find very, very strong female characters who are not the kind of people, not the kind of women that who would do what you would ask them to do. They know what they want in life. Now, the heroine of Ishaqzadeh in Ram Leela, let's talk about Deepika first. She's quite a feminist in the movie, the men hating type of feminist, you can say. And during the initial interactions of these two, we find a lot of conflicts between them. Similarly, in Ishaqzadeh, they are politicians. Both of the characters are involved into politics. Their families are from the political background and they stand as political rivals. It was a very smart move by the director, putting them as political rivals into the first place, and then they had conflicts about their personalities. When they interact, they do not fall in love in first glance. No, they were not Romeo and Juliet in that sense of the word. They took time. All these couples took their time to fall in love. It was a rational love. We find a lot of action. We find a lot of bullets. More bullets than Romeo and Juliet. We find more of action. We find thrill in every scene. We find beautiful item songs. That element of sensationalism was imbibed way too much in Romeo and Juliet than other adaptations. So the Shakespeare gave immense scope to bring all these elements into his script. A tragedy, couple dying together. In Ishaqzadeh, they in fact kill each other and die on the terrace. A sensational death. Helpless people around, as if people just lost the battle with love. And we see it in different settings. We find wonderful dialogues in Ishaqzadeh. We find beautiful costumes in Ram Leela. And this couple never got out of our heads. When they got married, we're happy, Romeo and Juliet finally together. So now, as we see the trajectory, as we follow the history, the Shakespeare is being carried ahead through time by Indians, but initially as it stood as a symbol of colonization. We were just learning Western ways through Shakespeare in theater and cinema in the early 20th century. But now at present, it stands as a symbol of independence. And how? Because we are able to do whatever we want with the script and we Indianize it to that level. We put masala into it, but it's not only masala, we are also putting our culture into it. We are modifying Shakespeare. We are making them Indian for Indians audience to watch. As Haider was put into Kashmir, now the director had multiple aims, not only the aim of adapting Hamlet into Haider. There were multiple aims involved. There were social intentions, there were messages given. That this movie became so important that it got banned in Pakistan. It had a lot of conflicts. It gave rise to conflicts in India as well. A very sensational movie, a very sensitive, controversial movie. Now that sums up the independence. Hamlet would not have done all this. Haider became way more powerful than Hamlet, for a matter of fact. We find a very different kind of Ophelia here in this character of Shraddha. Even though she is very innocent, just like Ophelia was, we find a veiled Ophelia, but she is not as ignored as Ophelia. While Ophelia became that of tremendous mad woman on the stage of Shakespeare, we did not see Ophelia dying on stage. We only see Gertrude talking about the death of Ophelia, how beautifully she died. She just drowned herself in the river in a white dress with a lot of flowers. And we see Shakespeare's audience cheering Ophelia's death as if this was the right thing to do. A lovesick madwoman had to die. But in the character of Urshia, we see different things. We see childishness, we see laughter involved. For a large part of the movie, she stands as a bubble in the water. She brings happiness. She brings a smile on the faces of audience. So when we talk about the Indian spectacle, we talk about the spectacle. Why is Shakespeare appealing to us is a big question. Why do we adapt from him too much? And there are different reasons. The script is providing ample scope. Shakespeare always provides scope to everyone, no matter in which country it is being adapted. The adaptation would be as smooth. The stories were very universal. He was writing things that can happen. He was writing things. He was writing characters. He was creating characters that would appeal to mankind in general and not only the English audience he was writing for. First of all, romance. The romance really appeals to the Indian psyche. We have a history of Bollywood, and we see what's getting hit. Even in other cinemas like South Indian cinema, the Tamil Malayali cinema, the Bhojpuri cinema, we would find the element of romance being repeated. Especially in the South Indian movies, the hero is very, very important. The camera most of the time follows the protagonist, the male lead. And Shakespeare was somehow doing the same while he wrote Richard III, Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth. We find the script following the protagonist everywhere, everything surrounding him. The other characters are important, they play a major role, but we want to know what happened with the protagonist. And that is something that Indian audience has been loving since the beginning of time, and it is still popular. Dialogues, of course. I'd also read out some dialogues, and we would somehow analyze how beautifully dialogues were transformed and why Shakespeare's script gave such powerful dialogues. Now, we cannot write dialogues irrespective of the script. No, we require a strong script, we require strong characters to write strong dialogues. The rhythm, the meter, everything comes into play, but it comes into play with respect to what's happening in the scene. The pitch becomes really important in that case. Number 3, action. Oh, we love action in our movies. The thrill, people fighting, taking out swords, taking out bullets at each other. The pistols, the guns, different kind of ways of fighting. Now, action, when we have historical movies, we have a different kind of action. But when we have movies like Ishaqzade, we have a different kind of action. We find two people running on terraces of houses of random people, and we find other people following them. We find half of them falling down, some of them getting injured on the way. We find straight action, and we also find we find police involved in Omkara. Now that's a totally different action. That is, can say, a justified action. We find misplaced violence in Maqbool, movies like Maqbool, Isak, misplaced violence, violence put on wrong people, taking out frustrations on the wrong people. Now, these scripts, Shakespeare's scripts, are providing ample scope to experiment. The sensationalism, the theatricality of Shakespeare's dramas. Shakespeare knew what to do. He gave soliloquies, he gave a lot of narration in between. It was required on the stage. One of the actors would come and narrate, somebody would say something. A large part of story, especially in Hamlet, was told through his own speeches. We find it happening less in Haider, but we find a different kind of Haider, screaming and wailing and crying and shouting. We do not find Hamlet doing it, but Haider would do it for us. The image of Shahid Kapoor, even if you Google Haider and you click on images, you would find one image of Shahid Kapoor repeating in which he is laughing or crying. You would not be able to make. It's a mad expression, crazy, one of a kind, something to be remembered, something to reside in our minds forever. Now, the movie makers are able to give it to us this way. And last but not the least, of course, I talk about the characters. Shakespeare is giving memorable characters, both the male and female, both the good and evil, the villains, the heroes, the anti-heroes. We find memorable characters. Even though we do not forget Omkara, but we also do not forget the face of Saif Ali Khan. We would remember the AI boy. We would remember him as an evil person. And it shows up not only in his dialogues and actions, but also in his demeanor. When we look at him, we know he is up to something bad. When we look at Vivek, we know that he would not wrong anyone. Oh, he is being wronged by people. The characters are to be remembered. We find Tabu, the Lady Macbeth, totally a memorable character. He's not the wife, she's not the wife, but she becomes the mistress, but she becomes important in the political action. She has something important to say. She has an influence over people, and she's aware of it. Let's just quickly read out a few dialogues. Let's see the difference. We have dialogues from Haider and Makbul, and we have dialogues from Omkara. They're written quite differently. Of course, they are into different settings. And now Haider and Makbul, people are speaking Urdu. In Omkara, people are speaking Hindi in a UP touch. And we find very, very strong dialogues written. They become quotes. In Makbul, he says, "आग के लिए पानी का डर बना रहना चाहिए." हैदर, जब तक हम अपने इंतकाम से आजाद नहीं हो जाते, तब तक कोई आजादी हमें आजाद नहीं कर सकती. Now they become quotations that you can actually paste on your walls. Similarly, Shakespeare was giving us dialogues that we do remember in all cases. We remember Shakespeare's dialogues so well. So when we have a strong scripts, we have action running, we have romance, we have sensationalism, we have theatricality. We also are able to deliver powerful dialogues from the mouths of powerful characters. Now we find Desdemona in Omkara speaking, "Chand jab aadha ho jave hai, na tab bhi chand hi kehlawe hai." It is a quotation, but when you read it in this language, it's not in any refined Urdu, it's not in refined Hindi, it's a mix. But you find that theatricality in the dialogue, not only in the written form, but also in the delivery. In 10 ml Love, the adaptation of Midsummer Night's Dream, you find people speaking dialogues of everyday use, not the theatrical dialogues like this, but there they will speak Hindi, come Urdu, come English, everything mixed together, just like we speak in our everyday life. They speak the market language. So we find in Omkara, we find Ishadzadeh, that tragedy somehow mixes with comedy. We have poetic language with very coarse slang, abusive language. We have morality with immorality. We have a lot of lust. We have different kind of sexualities. We have female sexuality being celebrated. We have Indian streets. We have mountains, we have Hindi, we have Urdu, English, Bhojpuri, everything mixed together with intense dance numbers, with intense music. We know movies could do without these item songs, but they were incorporated because the script allowed. And when we are adapting Shakespeare, we are allowed to adapt as much of sensationalism as we want to. Shakespeare's dramas were written for theater, were written to be performed. Vishwanathan, in his lecture on Shakespeare's plays and Indian sensibility, now he has got a lot on Shakespeare, and he made a very impactful comment. We certainly cannot give up our Shakespeare. The Indian audience would not give up Shakespeare. Shakespeare appeals to us. He is still relevant to us. When we read Shakespeare, we're like, oh, this makes sense. This can happen. Oh, we know some people like Iago. We know some people like Lady Macbeth. We know foolish women like Ophelia. We know lovesick people. When we read those characters, we are able to read, oh, the King Lear's dilemma, his conflict. Oh, that's very common. We find kids fighting for property with each other. We find that conflict of who will acquire the throne is still in our families. We find honor killings still present largely in our subcontinent. We find people fearing to fall in love with the people of other communities, other cultures. It's still not truly acceptable. We find a lot of diversity in conflicts, and our diversity in the diversity of Indian culture appeals to Shakespeare. We the impact of Shakespeare on us is as diverse as we are. So Shakespeare doesn't only stand as universal, he also stands versatile, as commented by Jeffrey Wilson in Harvard. When he says Shakespeare is versatile, we know he means Shakespeare can be adapted into any language and culture whatsoever. He's good for places, all kind of places, all times. And his drama does have a tendency to adapt to the writers of other age, to adapt to readers and audience of other age. And Shakespeare can speak to diverse cultures in diverse times in diverse languages. So that was the magic of Shakespeare. Last but not the least, I'd like to sum up with a beautiful comment made by Anil Tharkar in an interview. If you look around, you will find Shakespeare's dramas everywhere. These Shakespeare's characters everywhere. Every cup panchayat will have a story of Romeo and Juliet. Every politician can tell you the story of Macbeth. We find this politics is still running. We find people putting others down in politics, even the killings, even the murders. Cup panchayats, Romeo Juliet. We find these cases of honor killings every now and then. We find women being vilified, men being vilified just because they fell in love with the people of other cultures and communities. So this is how we talk about the Indian spectacle, how Shakespeare appeals to our senses. The literature and cinema, we cannot, as literature students, see these two things separate. We know they are intertwined, and we see that amalgamation of Eastern and Western elements into Shakespearean film adaptations on the Indian screen. Thank you very much. I sum it up here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, ma'am, for this very nice session. If anyone has any question, you can ask. I think no one have any question, ma'am. Thank you so much all the participants for your active participation. Let me inform to all that this complete session available on our Research Circle YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it again or want to share it to somebody, please do visit the Research Circle YouTube channel. Thanks. And last but not the least, thank you, Angela Zaini ma'am, for taking out time for a session. With your permission, I would like to end today's session here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.